In 2020 and 2021, a number of 3D printing companies went public by merging with SPACs. At the time, many investors had high expectations for 3D printing technology, which promised to revolutionize manufacturing across many industries. The core appeal lay in its ability to drastically reduce lead times, enhance production efficiency, and create parts with complex geometries that traditional manufacturing techniques could not produce. One of the biggest bulls on 3D printing was Cathie Wood's Ark Invest. In 2016, they launched an ETF focused solely on investing in 3D printing stocks. Unfortunately, like most of Cathie Wood's investment products, the 3D printing ETF has been a disaster. Since inception, it has declined by 1%. While a 1% decline doesn't sound horrible, it's important to note that this was during a massive bull market for stocks in general. During this same period, the S&P 500 increased by more than 160%. Of the three largest 3D printing companies to go public via SPAC, all of them have lost more than 95% of their value, and they all appear to be on the brink of bankruptcy. In this video, we'll look at why investors were initially so excited about 3D printing, and why these hopes failed to materialize. Just recently, a massive data breach covering multiple data brokers and 2.2 terabytes of data was exposed. This resulted in cybercriminals potentially gaining access to the personal information of over 100 million Americans. Think of things like your name, email address, home address, phone number, and much more. Unfortunately, these incidents have become all too common. The reality is, if you use social media, browse the web, or shop online, your personal information is almost certainly being tracked and sold. Websites sell your personal data to data brokers, who profit by selling it to pretty much anyone who's willing to pay. You have the right to contact each one of these hundreds of data brokers and ask them to delete your data. But this is a long and difficult process. That's why I use DeleteMe, who's also the sponsor of today's video. They do all the work for you. Just input your information and they'll automatically contact hundreds of known data brokers and compel them to remove your data. Within 7 days, they'll give you a report showing all the personal data they've removed for you. Take a look at all the data brokers that had my personal data, and DeleteMe has already removed them. I've already seen a massive decrease in spam emails as a result. And now you can get 20% off DeleteMe US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/WSM, or use the link in the description below and use the promo code WSM at checkout. Thank you to DeleteMe for sponsoring this video. And now back to 3D printing. This chart does a pretty good job of showing the psychology around 3D printing. 3D Systems Corp is one of the first companies to develop 3D printers. They IPO'd on the New York Stock Exchange all the way back in 1988. For the next 2.5 decades, they languished as a microcap. They failed to find sufficient real-world applications for their 3D printers, and only generated minuscule revenue. Very few investors were paying attention to 3D printing. This started to change around 2012 when the first hype cycle began. We'll call this the consumer hype cycle. Around that time, a few companies developed 3D printers that cost only a couple $1,000s and were small enough to fit in your home. The printers work by heating plastic and extruding it through a small nozzle. It moves back and forth, building up each layer on top of the last one until the object is complete. This process allows you to create custom objects, prototypes, or replacement parts right at home or in a small workshop. The idea was that 3D printing would become so easy that any hobbyist can use one. If you want to make a small trinket or spare part, you can just download a design from the internet and print it within a few hours. There's no need to go to the store. Many analysts and commentators predicted revolutionary outcomes. For example, in 2012, Wired magazine ran a cover saying 3D printers will change the world. The article boldly predicted that, probably in the next few years, the market will be ready for a mainstream 3D printer sold by the millions at Walmart and Costco. Wall Street quickly jumped onto the hype train. In 2010, 3D Systems stock was trading at around $4 per share. By the peak in 2014, it had increased 25-fold to almost $100. Unfortunately, reality did not live up to the hype. In theory, 3D printers allow anyone to download a design and print it at home. In practice, it's much more complicated. These printers are often finicky, with many parts prone to jamming or breaking. They require constant maintenance that most people aren't equipped to handle. Although there are many pre-made designs available online, the true value of 3D printing lies in creating custom parts, something that requires mastering complex design software. This steep learning curve demands significant time and effort, and the payoff is often underwhelming. Consumer 3D printers are generally limited to soft plastics, which aren't suitable for durable or mechanical parts. The finished prints frequently have imperfections like rough edges or fraying. On top of that, the plastic filament used in these machines is expensive. For most household items, it's far cheaper and easier to buy a similar product online than to print it yourself. The predictions that every family would have their own 3D printer never came to pass. Chances are that you don't own a 3D printer, and you probably don't even know anyone who owns a 3D printer. With that being said, there are some hobbyists who use 3D printers, and some companies use them to make prototypes of new products. If we look at 3D Systems' financial performance, their revenue indeed increased significantly during this period, from $160 million in 2010 to over $600 million in 2014. Despite the strong revenue growth, their profitability took a massive hit. While they were previously profitable, they reported an operating loss in 2015 and have continued to lose money ever since. So what happened? The short answer is Chinese competition. Soon after the hype began, dozens of Chinese manufacturers started rolling out consumer-grade 3D printers at very low prices. The intense competition has pushed profit margins down to rock-bottom levels. You can now buy low-end 3D printers for as little as $200. Once 3D Systems started losing money in 2015, their stock price collapsed like a souffle under a sledgehammer. This was the end of the first hype cycle. By this point, most investors had given up on 3D printing, but there was one major exception: Cathie Wood and her investment firm Ark Invest. They viewed the recent collapse in 3D printing stocks as an opportunity to buy the dip, so much so that in the summer of 2016, they launched a new ETF dedicated exclusively to investing in 3D printing related companies. Ark Invest conceded that the average household will likely never own a 3D printer. They instead believe the real winners would be massive industrial 3D printers that can produce complex metal parts. These industrial-scale printers aren't used by hobbyists. They are instead used by large manufacturing companies like General Electric, Boeing, Airbus, etc. Here's a short clip of Ark Invest analyst Tasha Keeney explaining this.
There was this period in 2014, 2015, where everyone thought there'd be a 3D printer in all of our houses, and that never happened. We don't think it ever will. The real opportunity for 3D printing is industrial use cases, so markets like the aerospace industry or healthcare, for instance. Aerospace engines, actually, in particular, have lots of complex parts, and when you 3D print them, you can actually reduce the number of parts that you need. So GE, for instance, has one part that goes in the turboprop engine. It used to be over 800 pieces, and now it's just 12 with 3D printing. And with that reduction, you also get 20% less fuel burn. 3D printing is roughly a $7 billion market today, and we think it could go to over $90 billion in the next 5 years.
Cathie Wood herself also talked up the revolutionary potential of 3D printing in public interviews.
Aerospace companies like Boeing and Airbus, their gross margins are in the 15 to 20% range. 3D printing, now that the FAA is approving it, 3D printing can cut those costs by up to 90%, as well as lower the weight and form factors of the various parts in engines and shrink the number of parts. So,
a 90% reduction in manufacturing costs. That sounds pretty good on paper. To understand the validity of Ark's bull thesis, we must understand how 3D printing of metal works, and how it differs from traditional metalworking techniques. In traditional metalworking, you start off by creating a mold in the shape of the part you want to make. You then pour liquid metal into the mold to create the part. There are technical limitations of how complex the mold can be. For complex parts, you might need to mold individual pieces of it separately and then weld them together. For extremely complex parts, it may not be feasible to create them with traditional methods. Engineers need to keep in mind these limitations when designing new metal parts. 3D printers, on the other hand, start off with fine metal powder. The metal powder is hit by a laser which melts it, fusing it together. This is done layer by layer. There are a few advantages of 3D printing. Firstly, new products can be designed purely with software. Once the design is finished, you can have a working prototype within days or even hours. Secondly, the 3D printer can make designs that are far more complex than was possible with traditional methods. While 3D printing has certain advantages, it also has disadvantages. Firstly, it's expensive. Large industrial-grade printers can cost millions of dollars, and you need skilled technicians to operate them. The powdered metal they consume is also around 5 times more expensive than regular metal. Finally, based on the way the metal powder is melded together with a laser, the end product is often weaker than parts manufactured in the traditional way. If we look at things from an economic perspective, traditional metalworking benefits tremendously from economies of scale. To make even one unit, you need to build a new mold, which can be an expensive and time-consuming process. But once the mold is complete, you can start churning out massive quantities of the product very quickly. As your production increases, the cost of the mold is amortized across a greater number of units. The total cost per unit converges to only slightly greater than the cost of materials. The cost curve for 3D printing looks very different. The setup costs are very low, but the variable costs are much higher. This is due to the high cost of the metal powder, as well as the high cost of the printing machines themselves. Each printer might take many hours to produce one unit, so if you want to ramp up production, you need to buy more 3D printers, which is very expensive. For the vast majority of metal products, 3D printing does not make sense, and likely will never make sense. For example, think of an automobile manufacturer that produces hundreds of thousands of cars per year. They are clearly better off using traditional metal making methods, which benefit from economies of scale. Of course, what Ark Invest is talking about is different. Their bull thesis relied on high-end manufacturers, for example Boeing and Airbus. They produce relatively small numbers of airplanes, which require very complex metal parts. Are these good candidates for 3D printing? In 2020 and 2021, 3 industrial 3D printing companies went public by merging with SPACs, Desktop Metal, Velo 3D, and Markforged. All of them were initially valued at more than $1 billion. These companies focused on printing custom order and complex metal parts for large industrial companies. This is exactly the type of use case that Cathie would envision when she launched the 3D printing ETF. Unsurprisingly, Ark invested in all 3 of these new public companies. Unfortunately, these investments ended up being disasters. To date, all 3 of the 3D printing SPACs have declined in value by more than 95%. So what went wrong? As we discussed earlier, the market for 3D printed metal parts is quite niche. 3D printing only makes sense for a few highly complex parts that need to be made only in limited quantities. In 2020 and 2021, all 3 companies posted impressive revenue growth. But by 2023, they had saturated the market and revenue started to decline. If you remember back to the first hype cycle, dozens of new manufacturers entered the market. This competition pushed pricing down to rock bottom levels. Something similar has happened with industrial 3D printers. The key aspects of metal 3D printing are not patentable, so dozens of manufacturers have popped up all over the world. This has similarly pushed prices down. Since going public, Desktop Metal, Velo 3D, and Markforged have all reported large and growing operating losses. The performance of the 3D printing ETF was so bad that in August of 2024, Ark Invest published a video on their YouTube channel trying to give an explanation.
So far, 3D printing has benefited users of the technology more than suppliers. We found that the 3D printing industry itself has grown slower than we have expected. And it looks like most of the value has been accruing in companies that utilize 3D printing technology. A great example of that is SpaceX. SpaceX uses 3D printing every day to make Raptor engines for the Starship. And one of the key suppliers for that process is Velo 3D, which makes support-free 3D printing machines. You can see here that SpaceX really dwarfs Velo 3D in both size but also earnings potential. One thing that could change this dynamic is software-enabled 3D printers. 3D printed machines with sensors that are able to collect data on each print can help send that information from 3D printing customers back to 3D printing manufacturers in order to improve the print process every time. In other words, this is a very similar process to what Tesla does today with over-the-air updates for vehicles. This could set up the printer manufacturers with more leverage as they would be adding more value to their relationships.
The core problem is that 3D printing has only very niche use cases and an abundance of suppliers. SpaceX uses Velo 3D's printers to make some parts for its rockets. If Velo decided to massively increase its prices, SpaceX would just choose a different supplier. The idea that Velo can make some magical software to solve all of its problems is a laughable cope. There's an old saying in Texas that if you fool me, you can't get fooled again. Unfortunately, investors in the 3D printing space didn't get the memo. Let's think back to the first hype cycle in the early 2010s. Demand for consumer printers was massively overestimated, and too many manufacturers entered the market, causing profits to collapse. The second hype cycle related to industrial printers followed a shockingly similar trajectory. Demand was overestimated, too many competitors, and profits collapsed. To be clear, 3D printing has proven valuable in specific industries. Companies like SpaceX, GE, and Airbus use it to manufacture critical components, such as rocket engines and aircraft parts. However, these use cases remain highly specialized, which has limited broader adoption. Growth-focused investors, including Cathie Wood, often see early-stage innovation and overestimate its transformative potential, projecting widespread disruption. Thus far, these bullish projections have rarely played out. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about 3D printing? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.